Good evening.
So I'm sending Linda.
Let me interrupt your conversations and welcome to the 29th annual UNCA Crystal Ball. This event has become a phenomenal tradition here in Western North Carolina for individual investors and small business owners and students and curious people from all walks of life. We're very pleased to sponsor the event and to have been associated with it since it moved to the Reuters Center. Previously, it was at Owen Hall, a much smaller event, and it's grown now to the point where the last number of years we've been here at Lipinski. Thank you to UNCA Department of Economics for hosting us tonight. 29 years is a long time. To look back to 1984, but actually the first crystal ball was 1985, 29 years ago, our gross domestic product stood at $3.9 trillion. Today, near $16 trillion. This is my favorite. A 10-year treasury paid 12.6%. Today, 1.9, I think, maybe 1.5.
1.7.
170 today? Thanks, Dave. It's a volatile number. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was 1,156. Today, I didn't get the close, but 14,600 approximately. Pretty amazing changes. 29 years is a long time. But when preparing for retirement, and for that matter, when living in retirement, 29 years that sort of perspective is necessary. Tonight's topic, is there a bond bubble? That's a great question. We've got two great economists to share their perspectives.
Round off.
But it is very clear to us,
I'll give you a basic.
bubble or not, investors need a very good financial plan, focused on the things that they control, able to model in various contingencies for the uncertain world. It is important to have an all-weather portfolio. Parsec Financial is the area's largest independent, fee-only fiduciary wealth management firm. As of 12/31/12, we manage $1.2 billion with 1,100 clients. We specialize in financial planning and money management. We provide trustee services through Parsec Trust, 401k consulting for small businesses. To learn more about Parsec Financial, our website is parsecfinancial.com. Thank you for being here tonight, and welcome to the 29th Crystal Ball. "29 years ago, Dr. Joe Sulak had a full, long black hair when he started on it, as I understand, 1985. And we want to welcome him to give us the next level of the introduction. Thank you.
Jim, did you have hair in 1985? Did you have any hair in 1985?
No.
I didn't think so. Okay. Thanks a lot, Rick, and many thanks to Parsec Financial for their unwavering and very generous support of this conference, which makes the event possible. I'm sure there are Parsec executives out there, and I'd appreciate it very much if you would stand up and be recognized. Even if you're retired. So as Rick told you, this conference has been around a long time. It's been around so long that it's possible that this is our last year of credibility. And why do I say that? As Rick told you, this is our 29th year. And there's an old saying that goes, never trust anyone over 30. So,
Only the hippies.
as I see it, this is the last year we can trust our speakers to give us an objective and professional analysis of what is happening with the economy and financial markets.
This is your 20.
Fortunately, this is not a dull economy. There are lots of interesting topics to discuss. And to make my point, I'm going to invoke Yogi Berra. For those of you who don't know Yogi Berra, Yogi was an all-star catcher with the New York Yankees, and he's a philosopher, probably better known as a philosopher for dispensing little nuggets of wisdom. And here's some of that wisdom, you know. Yogi said, you can observe a lot just by watching. If you don't know where you are going, you will end up somewhere else. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. And of course, who can forget, it ain't over till it's over. Now, regarding our economy, the talking heads tell us that, hey, you know, the economy is in the upswing, and that might be so. But I think Yogi would tell us this recovery is taking a very long time to recover. And we might ask, could our fiscal issues have anything to do with this long recovery? I mean, how long can government spending keep exceeding our revenues? And I definitely hear Yogi telling us deficits are not likely to balance the budget. And then we have the little matter of the Fed's easy money policies, which are better known as quantitative easing or QE. And by the way, they call it quantitative easing to make the policies sound cool, okay? The result is absurdly low interest rates, so low that the interest I get on my savings is so small that the IRS does not care whether I even report it. And I can hear Yogi telling us quantitative easing makes interest rates of no interest to investors. Now, I've got other issues, but I will stop here. Addressing these are outside of my skill set, and I think they would even baffle Yogi if he were here. But fortunately, we have, sitting to my right, we have two very top-notch and very trustworthy economists who I'm sure will address these and other issues. And our first trustworthy speaker is Dave Burson. And Dave is truly one of the most versatile people I know. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to call him a 21st century Renaissance man. For starters, Dave has a double major in history and economics from Williams College. He also has a master's in public policy and a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. He's been successful. You know, that's
What?
my school. Sorry, Michigan. Sorry.
Now, my daughter went to UVA for
That's
law
right. I know,
school.
yeah. His daughter did go to UVA. It was a Freudian slip. I was trying to be like you, you know, so I associated your accomplishments with my school. Okay. In any event, Dave has also been successful as an actor, as a member of his town council, as a baseball coach, as an advisor to a number of colleges, as a board member, and I could go on and on ad nauseum. Oh, yes.
Hello?
Somebody correcting the Virginia slip. He's also been quite successful as an economist. A short list of what he's done. He's been a professor of economics at the prestigious Claremont Graduate School. He's been chief financial economist for Wharton Econometrics, which is an internationally known consulting firm. He's been president of the National Association of Business Economists. He's been vice president and chief economist at Federal National Mortgage Association, and currently he is senior vice president and chief economist at Nationwide Insurance, where he heads a team that provides analyses for virtually all of the company's business units. Dave, it is a real honor to be your friend, and it is a real pleasure to have you with us this evening. And I believe you're... I think he's also an expert on Yogi Berra, actually.
UVA? At least he didn't say Ohio State. It is very interesting having 2 degrees from the University of Michigan living in Columbus, Ohio. It is interesting. So, Joe, I have a question for you. What year did you win the Masters? Nobody else wears a green coat like that except members at Augusta.
Like 2 minutes. I get that question. When did you win the Masters? I say never. Okay. And I get another question. Well, did somebody who won the Masters give it to you? I say no, that did not happen. Then they ask, did you poach it from somebody that won the Masters? No, I did not. The truth is, I got my coat where most professors get their coats, flea market. Okay?
Why does that answer not surprise any of us? Thank you, Joe. Now we know the full story. Now, I've only been coming to these for about 20 years, so you can trust me for another 10. Well, if you trust me at all. So, what's going on in the economy? What do I think will happen until we meet this time next year? This, in June, this expansion will be 4 years old. How many of you feel like there hasn't been any expansion at all? By almost every measure, this has been the slowest recovery in history. And while I don't see an end to it, in fact, I think we will continue to grow for some time and maybe even accelerate some next year, maybe not this year, but next year. This is going to remain for a while a tepid recovery. In the handout I gave you, there's a map that shows unemployment rates by state. Now, the unemployment rate nationally was at the peak almost 10%, and today it's 7.5%, so it's come down a lot. Now, some portion of that, a large portion of that, is due not to strong job growth, but to people leaving the labor force, what economists would call a decline in the labor force participation rate. But what's really interesting is if you look at that map, which shows unemployment rates by state, there are still a number of states, unfortunately North Carolina being one. I won't mention North Carolina anymore. I'll just let you do it. At least I didn't mention Virginia. Where the unemployment rate is still over 9%. And again, the recession ended almost 4 years ago. We all want to be North Dakota. We all want the North Dakota economy. Let me rephrase that.
Yes.
In fact, North Dakota was the only state during the housing bust to set records month after month for house price gains. We all want to be North Dakota. But we have Nevada, California, Illinois, North Carolina, New Jersey, Rhode Island, all with unemployment rates over 9%. Now, this is not just a geographic thing. These are states in very diverse parts of the country. And there aren't a lot of states where unemployment is below 6%. Now, most economists would say that the full employment unemployment rate, what's the unemployment rate when we consider ourselves at full employment? Today, given labor force changes, probably somewhere between 5 and 6%. I might be on the lower part of that range, and I might find a few economists outside that range, but most would be somewhere between 5 and 6. And again, not many states with unemployment below even 6. So even though there are some states like North Dakota that are doing great, and some states like North Carolina where unemployment is very high, even the rest of the states aren't doing great. Having said that, growth's going to slow in the middle of the year. That's not good news either. The good news, though, is that what I would call the core economy, the private sector economy, showed signs of gaining strength at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. The tax increases from the fiscal cliff and the spending cuts from the sequester will almost certainly slow the economy over the middle 2 quarters of this year. How much? Our estimates are anywhere from about a half to a full percentage point. So right now, we expect growth in 2013, real GDP growth, to be 2%, a little above 2, somewhere in that range, which means in the absence of those deficit cutting measures, and there were good reasons to have deficit cutting measures, don't get me wrong, but the way we chose to do it wasn't necessarily good. But in the absence of those, we would have seen growth much closer to 3%. Now that sounds better, and indeed, it would have been the strongest year in this expansion. But over the long run, economic growth on average is about 3%. So the best we would have done this year has been close to average. And normally in a recovery, we grow much faster than average. So while 3% sounds good, and indeed it is good, it would have been the best growth we would have had since 2007? 2007. That's a long time ago now. It's still not really strong. And as I said, the tax increases, the government spending cuts will slow it. But the economy will learn to live with those things. We don't like the tax increases, but we'll adjust. The spending cuts, if the sequester stays in place, it's not just this year, it's the next 9 years. But the economy will learn to live with that as well. So next year we expect growth to be between 2.5 to 3. And then after that, a little above 3 for a couple of years. Unemployment will come down even beyond just the declines in labor force participation rates because of stronger economic growth. Those unemployment rate declines are going to be modest unless we see a lot more people leaving the labor force. So things will look better. Indeed, they will be better a year from now than they are today. But they won't be great. Just like this year, we're better than we were a year ago with the economy, but it's not great. I have a hard time seeing the things that will go into place that will make the economy great. And I have a difficult time seeing what will cause the expansion to derail altogether. But I just don't see how it's going to strengthen a lot. Some perhaps, but not a lot. Now, the stock market doesn't seem to care about that. As long as the economy is growing and corporate profits are good, and the Fed is adding ample liquidity, that's important, we'll get back to that in a minute, then the trend in the stock market should be up. I don't know where it's going to be tomorrow. I don't know where it's going to be next week or next month or next quarter. But I'm willing to bet you a reasonable amount of money that a year from now it'll be higher than it is today. So there are going to be periods where it goes down, periods where it goes up. But the trend, if the economy is growing and corporate profits are up and the Fed is providing ample liquidity, the trend almost certainly has to be up unless something happens internationally, a shock that is hard to see right now, but could occur. And these risks always are there. And as we saw with the tragedy in Boston, they can occur at any time. In the absence of something like that that's really major, the stock market should continue to rise. How about interest rates? Well, as Joe said, the Fed continues to conduct quantitative easing because they've already lowered the federal funds rate to 0. And they wanted to have even more expansionary monetary policy. So the Fed has been buying Treasury securities. They've been buying agency mortgage-backed securities. There are interesting discussions among the leaders of the Federal Reserve now about when it will start to taper off its purchases under the quantitative easing program. And if you listen to one Fed governor or another, or one regional Fed president or another, you won't know when they're going to do it. And the thing is, neither do they. If you listen carefully to what they say, they're saying if things improve enough, we may be able to start tapering off or even ending quantitative easing. But that suggests that growth will have to accelerate, not only from what I think it's going to be, and it's going to, I think, be slower in the middle part of the year, but probably even than what we've seen over the last year or two. Now, Fed Chair Ben Bernanke has mentioned 6.5% unemployment as a level at which the Fed would consider actually perhaps tightening monetary policy, not just ending QE, but starting to raise the federal funds rate. If, in fact, we get to 6.5%, and it's mostly because labor force participation rates continue to go down, not because job growth is even at historical norms, then the Fed will ignore that 6.5%. For the Fed to change policy significantly, to tighten, it will require the economy evidencing more strength. I just don't see it in the near term. Eventually, yes. If you look carefully at the last page of our handout, 2015. So in 2 years when I come back, if the Fed hasn't tightened yet, if it has, I'm wrong, then I'll start to talk about a near-term outlook in which the Fed starts to tighten. But I don't think you have to worry about that this year, probably not even next year. Well, how about QE? Because the Fed can start to taper off its purchases of assets without actually tightening monetary policy. By tapering off QE, it's simply slowing the rate at which it's becoming expansionary. Instead of buying $40 billion in agency securities and $45 billion of treasuries every month, perhaps it will, so 85 total, perhaps it will lower it to 60 billion. That's not tightening, it's just less fast easing. Or then maybe if things pick up, they'll slow it to 30 billion or 20 billion. It's not tightening. But it is one of the things that helps to boost financial markets. So once the Fed starts to pull back from QE, the stock market will probably go down. Permanently? Well, nothing's ever permanent, but a long period of time, significantly. Again, tapering QE is not tightening monetary policy. It's simply expanding it less quickly. And as long as the Fed is expanding monetary policy, the trend in the stock market should be up, again, as long as the economy is growing. And I think both those things will be in place. We think the Fed will start to taper quantitative easing early in 2014. There's a chance if things really pick up, perhaps it'll be later this year. I think the odds greatly favor 2014 instead. So we will have ample liquidity for a while. And what does that mean for interest rates? Well, short-term rates are anchored at zero. As long as the federal funds rate's at zero, it's hard for other short-term rates to move up. So your checking account is still not going to pay anything, nor will your savings accounts, nor will short-term CDs or short-term treasuries. They're anchored where the Fed keeps Fed funds. Zero for Fed funds, slightly above that for other rates, but not much. While the Fed can control the federal funds rate and greatly control short-term rates, it doesn't control long-term rates. It can influence them. Short-term rates and long-term rates are tied together, not in lockstep, but closely. And as long as the market expects a 0% federal funds rate, then long rates can't move too far away from where they are. They can move some, though. And a month ago, in fact, I was wrong when I corrected Rick on the 10-year Treasury. It's not 1.7, it's 1.685. It's even lower than I thought. But a month ago, it was 2.05. Rates have come down by 35 basis points, a third of a percentage point in a month. Economy perhaps looks a little weaker now that the spending cuts are starting to take place and the tax increases are here. But it's mostly because things look worse in other parts of the world. Cyprus, Greece, little Cyprus, Korea. And investors around the world are taking their funds out of areas that they consider to be more risky, much of the Eurozone, and putting it back in U.S. financial investments. So much of this decline in, say, the 10-year Treasury and other long-term rates, not just Treasury rates, but private rates as well, over the last 5 to 6 weeks has come from a flight to quality. if there are no more flights to quality, if things start to look better in Europe, then that will reverse. And if later this year the economy looks better, as I suspect it will, as we start to get used to the tax increases, the federal spending cuts, and the private economy grows more quickly, borrowing will pick up, and there will be more discussion about the ending of quantitative easing, including by the Fed presidents and FOMC members. So the market will start to look even more ahead to QE being tapered off and ending. So in the absence of these flights to quality, long-term rates should edge up. A lot? Probably not. Maybe 2.25 by year end for the 10-year. But I can't promise you that these flights to quality are going to end. We didn't really know all the problems in Greece. None of us saw Cyprus. What's the next one? I don't know. I'd like to know. I could make a lot of money if I knew. So could you. But I don't know. But they're out there, and they appear at irregular times. So while I'm still comfortable saying that long-term rates should edge up over the course of the year, it's likely to be very irregular, because there are going to be periods where there's more flight to quality, so rates will go up, and then they'll drop down suddenly, and then when things look better, they'll start to go up again. So the trend should be irregularly upward, but not a lot. Again, 2.25% 10-year Treasury note. Now, that sounds like a lot when we're about 1.7. Indeed, it's about 50 basis points. 50 basis points over the course of the next 7 months, 8 months, isn't a lot. It's a relatively small move in rates over that portion of a year. Now, next year, if the Fed really does start to taper quantitative easing, and the economy looks a little bit stronger, unemployment comes down still more, then financial markets will start to talk about an actual tightening of Fed policy, maybe later in 2014, but more likely, as we think, in 2015. And that view to the Fed actually beginning to tighten, and we're not talking about the federal funds rate going from 0 to 5 in a day, or even a year, or even 2 years, 3 maybe, but not even 2. But that actual tightening of Fed policy should, starting next year, allow long-term rates to go up more quickly than this year. But until the Fed actually starts to raise the federal funds rate, short-term rates are going to be stuck around 0. So this year we think the yield curve will steepen a little bit. Next year we think it will steepen more. Now, that's good for some things and bad for others. The housing market has certainly benefited from record low mortgage rates. Now, it's benefited more because the economy is no longer in recession. And while job growth isn't strong by historical measures, it's positive and at least decent. And because of that, households are being formed. During the Great Recession, we had the smallest 2-year increases in households in America since World War II. Kids moved in with parents. Unrelated people moved in together because might have lost jobs, they were scared of losing jobs, they didn't want to live together. The kids didn't really want to live with the parents didn't really want the kids to move in with them. And now that the job market looks better, unemployment's down, we're seeing households being created again more quickly. So household formation rates are rising, and every household lives somewhere. I've talked about that to this group before. Well, we're starting to see the households picking up, and that's helping the housing market even more than low mortgage rates. The low mortgage rates help. But one of the things that we will see if long rates pick up is mortgage rates start to rise. Does a 4% 30-year fixed rate mortgage seem high to you? We haven't been to 4% for a while. Seems really high. But except for the last year, those are the lowest mortgage rates we've ever seen since we've had 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Yet it seems so high now. What's a normal level for mortgage rate? Well, if you look at the average level for the 10-year Treasury and add some spread onto that, 10-year Treasury shouldn't be 1.7. Probably ought to be around 5. 3% real growth, 2% inflation. 5% nominal growth, about the same for the 10-year Treasury. Add about 100 to 150 basis points, 1.5 percentage points to that to get a mortgage rate. Mortgage rates in a normal environment should be 6, maybe 6.5%, not 3.5%. So as the long rates start to move up, mortgage rates will rise, but it's going to be a long time, years, before those mortgage rates even get back to what we would consider normal levels, not high levels, but normal levels, because we're well below normal now. Who will it help? Lending institutions, banks primarily, make money by borrowing short and lending long, playing the yield curve. And if the short end of the yield curve is anchored around zero for the next year or two, and long rates are edging up, yield curve steepens, then their profit opportunities by lending increase. You know, there were some good things with QE. The biggest bad thing with QE, at least for now, is that by flattening the yield curve, the Fed has made it less profitable for banks to lend. It's not unprofitable, don't get me wrong, but less profitable. But as the yield curve steepens over the next year or two, it will become more profitable for banks to lend, and so they will invest less in treasuries and more in lending money to you for various things. Even if it's at a higher rate, that's the point. Because it's at a higher rate, they will lend it to you. And one of the major things that has held this economy back is less lending in this expansion than we've seen in previous expansions. A steepening of the yield curve, I think, will help that a lot. There are risks to QE beyond the flatter yield curve. At some point, the liquidity the Fed's adding to the system, which I think is necessary today, and the economy would, I think, be growing more slowly today if the Fed were not adding liquidity dramatically. The concern is eventually it will be inflationary. And indeed it will be if the Fed doesn't take it out. The Fed's going to have to be very nimble eventually, taking out what will then be excess liquidity, just pushing prices up, without doing it so slowly that inflation does pick up, or doing it so quickly the economy stumbles. How many of you think the Fed will get that exactly right? Now, but here's the more interesting question. Once the Fed actually does start to tighten, how many of you think the Fed will tighten too quickly? How many of you think the Fed will tighten too slowly? That's a different vote. I think it's more likely, but this is just a supposition on my part, that initially the Fed will tighten too slowly, we'll get a little bounce up in inflation, and then the Fed will tighten too quickly, and that will be the cause of the next downturn. But now we're talking about maybe 2018 or 2019. And this will have been an 8 to 10 year expansion at that point. That's a long expansion. And while they don't necessarily die of old age, it will have been a long expansion. And historically, these expansions come to an end when the Fed does tighten too much, and we get not a steep yield curve, not a flat yield curve, but an inverted yield curve, where the Fed forces short-term rates up so much that short-term rates rise above long-term rates. That's nothing to worry about this year, next year, the year after that. 4 years from now, maybe. Maybe even 3 years from now, but probably not. But 4 years from now, 5 years from now, I'd be very concerned about that. Because the Fed at that point will have to take a lot of liquidity out pretty quickly in order to keep inflation from going up. But for the next year, and then we'll talk about this again a year from now, I think that we will see modest economic growth, unemployment rate coming down some, interest rates still very low, and the stock market on trend continuing to move up. So with that, I'm going to stop. And now my good friend Jim Smith gets to talk. It's interesting. Joe gets to research all sorts of things with me, and he introduces me, and then he says, Dave, you get to introduce Jim. Okay, I love to. Jim and I, so we're talking about anniversaries. 2013 is the 30th anniversary of Jim and I knowing each other. When I went to work as a young economist at Wharton Econometrics, Jim was the chief economist at Union Carbide. And the first, actually it was the second, meeting that WIFA, Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates, WIFA had that I went to was in Connecticut, and Jim hosted a party at his house. The thing I remember most was his family room had a wrought iron circular staircase. I thought that was so cool. And it was so cool. So I've known Jim for 30 years. And I've talked about him before. You know, what you probably don't know is, I mean, Jim was a well-established economist 30 years ago, and I'm just starting out. And Jim was very kind, introducing me to people, the other business economists at Wharton Econometrics, who were clients. But most importantly, introducing me to two groups. NABE, the National Association for Business Economics. Back then it was National Association for Business Economists. We've rebranded ourselves, and actually very successfully. And Jim got me into the leadership there, but it was you who did that. And second, another smaller group of economists, the National Business Economic Issues Council, NBEIC. That's a not very easy name, NBEIC. And there are 40 of us now, but it's been 30 to 40 leading economists in different sectors of the economy. In fact, Jim hosted a meeting here last fall, so I got to come to Asheville in the fall too. So twice last year it was very nice instead of just the one time that I normally come. But again, Jim, you have been very kind to me over my career in lifting me up to your level, and I appreciate that. So for the next hour, hour and a half, no, half hour, whatever, Jim Smith.
Thank you, David. You've made many contributions to NAB. It's been great to have you in NBEIC all of these years. I should point out that a personally even more important contribution to me was indirectly made by David about 14 or 15 years ago now. The lady we refer to as the other wife decided that her pastures were greener somewhere else. 37 years, it just wasn't doing it for her, so she left. And like many people who've had that experience, I was a miserable wretch. Really, really pathetic. And David's administrative assistant at the time and her husband invited me over to their home for dinner. We were all living in the Washington, D.C. area, and they quickly realized what a pathetic, miserable person I was. And the wife, who was David's admin, said, gee, we just hired this really terrific lady at our church. She's single. Would you like me to see if she has a PhD? She's very intelligent. And I said, oh yeah, wow, woo, an actual live woman, this would be great. So this lovely lady and I went on a blind date, and the other funny connection, another good friend of ours is John Sylvia, who's now chief economist for Wells Fargo, and the only other person besides me from North Carolina who's in the Wall Street Journal survey and Bloomberg and other ones every month, as is David, but he doesn't live in North Carolina. But John was in Washington at that time, and he and I went out to dinner. He was working for the Senate Banking Committee, and so we shared a lot of what's happening, what's going on. And we went to the best restaurant in Alexandria, Virginia, so I could scout out the particular table to bring my blind date to. The long story short, we will have been married 12 years in another 4 months. So as she's blushing here in the front row, so that's good. David said he would like to know where the next crisis in Europe is coming from. I will tell you, so you don't have to be in suspense. If you want to worry about all the mess in Europe, think of a simple phrase: gypsies. That is spelled G-I-P-C-I-S-S, gypsies. G for Greece, I for Ireland, P for Portugal, C for Cyprus, I for Italy, S for Spain, and just this week, the second S for Slovenia. All part of the Eurozone. The Cyprus economy is 1.5 times the size of the Asheville economy. Asheville is a global economic power. We are a $15 billion economy. We're 50% bigger than Afghanistan. Now look at how much money we spend in Afghanistan. Think of if you spent it all in Asheville, you people in Washington. Don't send us the bombs and the IEDs, but, you know, just the investment. As Europe goes down the drain, the Eurozone, not the European Union, the Eurozone, if it really hits a crisis, which is entirely possible, I'll tell you why in a minute, you will see a flood, not a river, a flood of European investment coming to the United States. Right now, Joe's cover question, is there a bond? None of this is in the handout, by the way, so you have to take notes. I give you that for a takeaway piece so you can learn other stuff. Is there a bond bubble? Yes, there is. It is in Germany. Everybody in Europe, Germany is by far the largest country in Europe. It is the 4th largest country in the world behind the United States, China, and Japan. Then comes Germany, then France, then the UK, then Italy. I'm sorry, China. Yeah, China second. Okay. Everybody in Europe, whoa, let's fly to safety. Let's invest in 10-year Bunds, German government bonds. Great idea, but what happens when everybody wants to invest in a bond? The price goes up, the yield goes down. So the yield is around 1.5%. Inflation is around 2%. You're losing money up front. Even at 1.69% here, that's no worse than inflation. We don't have an inflation problem, neither does Europe, but when the bond bubble is in Germany, if you want to lose money, buy a 10-year German bond. Guaranteed, you will lose money. Beware of the gypsies. They will cause many, many problems. How on earth can a tiny place like Cyprus, 800,000 Greek Cypriots, 300,000 Turkish Cypriots, blow up the entire world? Because policymakers don't think. Here was their brilliant solution. Oh, there's a crisis in the banking system. Okay, let's solve it. It's a 15 billion euro crisis. That's 100%, or I'm sorry, it's 75% of GDP. Okay, we, the European Union, the IMF, and the European Central Bank, will contribute 10 billion euros. The other 5 billion, we'll just take it from the depositors. Originally, all of them. A few sensible people said, don't we have deposit insurance? Because you have the same level. Deposit insurance in all of the Eurozone is 100,000 euros per account. So they revised it. We won't take anything from an insured account. We'll take 15% from everything above that. Why did they do this? Because there's an election in Germany in September. What? Angela Merkel, Dr. Angela Merkel, PhD in nuclear physics, a brilliant lady, wants to be reelected. Every single penny the Eurozone spent, or I'm sorry, Euro cent that they spend, well, let's make it a euro dollar, 27.9 euro cents comes from German taxpayers. Germany is benefiting hugely from the Eurozone, but no politician has been able to explain the reasons there are problems in all these other countries is because you, good German that you are, have decided to work really hard, produce a lot, export. Half the German economy is exports, 12% of the US, put it in comparison. And the reason, and that renders all those other countries uncompetitive, and they have huge problems. If we can get through the September elections in Germany without another crisis, and Chancellor Merkel is reelected, then they can proceed to solve European problems. But every European government, except in the Netherlands, that has faced election since the crisis started 3 years ago, has lost. There's not a good track record. She's very worried. So German elections trumping everything. Let me give you the good news. Think about this, because people never think about this. Since 1947, January 1, with only 730 exceptions, every single day from January 1, 1947 through today, if we had seasonally adjusted daily global GDP data, has been a new world record. The only exceptions, 1973 and 2009. Those are the only 2 years since the beginning of 1947 in which the global economy has declined. We are not necessarily the United States, not necessarily any one country, but the world is growing almost all the time. Big headlines on Tuesday. International Monetary Fund cuts outlook for global growth from 3.5% to 3.3%. No one will ever know. They can't measure it that closely. But growth, Europe is going down. Europe is in a the Eurozone is in a depression with a D, more than a 10% decline in output over a 4-year period. Greece has been in recession for 6 years, Spain for 4. The Europe-wide unemployment rate is 12.5%. 1 out of every 8 people who would like to have a job doesn't have one. In Spain, it's 28%. Oh, it gets worse. If you're under 25 in Europe, the whole Eurozone, your unemployment rate is 27%. If you're in Spain, it's 58%. Right. Think about your friends, Rebecca. They mostly unemployed if they were living in Spain. But they still eat well and drink well. And enjoy the bullfights. But it's a terrible crisis. Switch around the other side of the world. Let's look at the world's 3rd largest economy, Japan. Never have we seen a worse problem in a developed country. The good news, Japan is really, really wealthy. On a per capita basis, the only countries wealthier than Japan, the wealthiest country in the world, Norway, the blue-eyed Arabs. 4.5 million people, a lot of oil and gas, and brilliant politicians for 2 generations now, and a brilliant king. Why do I say brilliant? Because when they first discovered the oil and gas in the North Sea, everybody agreed and they formed public opinion. This will not last forever. We want to save the bounty from these riches for our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. So they have what's called a sovereign welfare fund that is globally diversified, and if they didn't pump another barrel of oil or another 1,000 cubic feet or million cubic feet of natural gas, Norway would be rich forever. After Norway, second richest country is Luxembourg. Third, with a big asterisk, is Brunei. Why the asterisk? The Sultan has 90% of the money and everybody else has 10%. So on average, they're really rich. You know, he's the guy that a few years ago, his kids loved Michael Jackson, who was then alive, and flew him in to do a birthday concert for his children. I'm not sure what that cost, but more than $1.98. And then comes the United States, and then comes Japan. Japan has a shrinking population, and the tsunami last year, of course, made that worse. Shrinking labor force for a decade. Hardly any women are having children. So every day, the proportion of the population 65 and above goes up and up and up. And they allow about 100 people a year to be naturalized Japanese citizens. And they won't change that for a whole lot of reasons. If you really want to know, my champion bridge-playing friend down here, who lived in Japan with his wife and children, can tell you how much their children loved it. And I mean, literally, that was not in quotes, really did love it. It's a wonderful country. But why? If you're not Japanese, you're never going to become Japanese, right, Fred? I mean, it's just not going to happen. And they're maybe not next year's crystal ball, but by the year after, their financial system will have imploded with unknown consequences globally. Really unknown. Nobody knows. But one day, the Minister of Finance will announce, oops, we spent all our foreign reserves. Japanese people own all the Japanese government bonds, JGBs, that they could ever want. So we're going to have to sell bonds on global markets. Their interest rates that day, well, they will probably rise by an immeasurable amount because they have announced the most insane scheme in the history of the world to have the central bank buy up all the government bonds, which means the yield has already dropped from 0.75 to 0.6 to 0.5 to 0.50. It will go to 0.0. The government will sell zero coupon bonds and the central bank will buy them. Yeah, wonderful. But the day their interest rates goes from 0 to whatever, you know, David's forecast, 2.5%, 3.5% world 10-year bond rates, think about the value of every financial. The banks will have sold all theirs, so they'll be all right. The insurance companies and the pension funds will be kaflooey. And Japan matters a lot. Many people think we're going to be saved by China. No, China's very, very poor. Nobody looks at the demographics of China. Demographics are fun. You can look at 50-year trends. The only thing that can change them in countries that allow immigration is a wave of immigration. Ain't going to happen in China. Could happen here. Could happen in Canada, could happen in Australia, but ain't going to happen in China. They've had a one-child policy since that lunatic Mao Zedong was running the country. Think of what 40-plus years of a one-child policy mean. You have no brothers or sisters. You have no aunts or uncles. You have no cousins. It's just you, your parents, your grandparents, and if you're really, really lucky, your great-grandparents, until you say, What happens when I retire? Now, David talked about our demographic household formation problem of children moving in with their parents. Okay, that happens in China, but then the grandparents move in with the parents, and the great-grandparents move in with the parents, and the poor one kid says, I got to support all of you. Now it's even worse. There's an enormous preference for male children. Result, demographics again, people under age 25 in China, 120 boys for every 100 girls. What do you tell a young Chinese who wants to get married? Come to California, where we have the most Chinese American women available anywhere outside of China. It's a nightmare, and their labor force is already shrinking. You don't see that reported anywhere, but you can look it up, as they say. Okay. Ooh, almost out of time. What should you, well, don't worry about it, as David said. The U.S. is going to keep growing this year, next year, year after, several more years down the road until you see the inverted yield curve he told you about, and then we'll have another recession. It shouldn't be for a very long time. Economists have a concept, which we can't really measure completely accurately, but the concept is all that matters here, called potential GDP. What would the level of the economy be if we had full employment, which is usually defined as unemployment rate around 4.8% or so? We had a low unemployment rate so that most people who wanted a job had a job. They were producing to their best of their ability. Well, you look at a trend line. If you look at a trend line for the United States, from 1929 through 2011, we grew 3.1% a year. Obviously, not every year. We had big negatives in several years in the 1930s, huge positives in the 1950s, some in the 1960s, but the average compound annual growth rate, 3.1% a year. David just told you how the weakest recovery ever in the post-war period. Actually, the weakest recovery since at least 1910. It's really, really weak. We don't know exactly why. Many people have theories. No one knows exactly why. So you have potential GDP up here, actual GDP down here. That gap right now is at least 8%, maybe 10 or even 11%. That means we could grow 4 or 5% a year for 2 or 3 years to get back to the trend line, then slow to 3. There's a wonderful project I recommend to all of you at the George W. Bush Presidential Institute at my alma mater, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, so I have to give them a plug. It opens to the public on May 1. There are many educational parts as well, of course, as the Presidential Library. One of those is run by a lady named Amity Shlaes, S-H-L-A-E-S, who's just recently written a wonderfully well-received biography of Calvin Coolidge, who achieved the best growth of any president in the 20th century during his term. He was known as Silent Cal, famous for once at a White House dinner sitting next to a socialite from New York. He says, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm so excited to meet you. I bet all my friends I could get you to say more than 3 words to me." He looked at her, and he opened his mouth, and he said, "You lose." True story. Silent Cal. But he knew how to do 2 things, cut taxes and create jobs. We cut taxes every year that Coolidge was income taxes, every year that Coolidge was president, and we brought in more revenues. A brilliant scheme. Anyway, she's the head of something called the 4% Growth Project. That is in your handout, so you can get the reference to it and check. The 4% Growth Project is all about what would we have to do to get the U.S. growing above 4%. Answers: cut taxes, flatten taxes. My personal preference, enact H.R. for House of Representatives 25, the fair tax bill. Flat tax, they sell it as 23% of the price of everything, but that of the total price. But if you think that includes the taxes, then that means 30%. It's in your handout. 30% on the price of the goods or services. Get rid of every other tax. No income tax, no estate tax. Thank you. I'm not the czar, unfortunately. Start on tax. Secondly, form a national committee for rational regulation. Estimates are the dead weight loss. That means, and these come from economists who are Democrats or Republicans or don't even vote. I guess we call them atheist economists. I don't know. That the dead weight loss, the excess of costs over benefits, $1.5 trillion a year. That's 10% of GDP. And that's at the federal level. The state level, there are many more. Worst is California. We're not terribly bad in North Carolina, and I think the governor has an effort to reduce that, because anyone who's been a mayor, as he was for a long time, can see the problems of excessive regulations. Those are the two big things to do, and we would see ourselves moving toward 4% growth, putting people back to work. A huge problem with the economy today, nobody knows why this is true. There are lots of theories, but we don't know. A huge problem is that we have the lowest labor force participation rate. That means the proportion of people age 16 and above who want a job since March 1979. That participation rate peaked in 2000 at 66.0%. If we had that today, instead of 7.5% unemployment, we would have 11.8%. So you can get lower unemployment just by having people say, I can't get a job, I give up. It's a national bad situation. We don't spend enough time studying economic growth by states. We did. We know North Carolina is booming. Oh, North Carolina definitely is not booming, sadly. North Dakota, one letter in the alphabet, is booming. Why? Because they're drilling for oil and gas. And they're finding it. We might find it in North Carolina, who knows? And then you would see an interesting economic boom. But beyond North Carolina, North Dakota, if you look across states, since 2007 when the recession began, or since 2000, right before the last recession, basically 50 states and the District of Columbia, there's Texas and there's everybody else. Texas has added well over 1 million jobs. Nationally, we're still 3 million short of where we were in February 2008. 4 million if you look at the household survey. We got a lot of work to do. We're on the right track. The economy's gaining momentum. If we could get small business people enthused, we still have a two-track economy. Big businesses doing very, very well. All-time record levels of corporate profits, S&P 500 doing just phenomenally well, and small businesses absolutely miserable. Every month, look at the National Federation of Independent Business Index of Business Confidence, put together by our good friend Bill Dunkelberg, who's their chief economist, and you will see it's at recession levels. So you can get small business happier. That would create a lot of jobs. Get the tax burden lower, raise the same amount of revenue or more, growth would boom. Reduce regulation, growth would boom. but we are growing and we are moving in the right direction. Thank you all for coming. It is. We are happy to entertain questions.
Remember to please go to the microphone.
Right, go to a mic.
And I want to thank both Parsec Financial for underwriting this and my good friend, Dr. Joe Sulak, whose idea was 29 years ago to start this, and it continues to be a good idea, Joe. Great.
May I ask a question with a caveat?
Okay.
The question is, what will a 17 trillion, soon to be 20 trillion dollar deficit have on the economy, with the caveat of, could you answer it with what you were taught, not with what you know?
You want to go or you want me to go?
You can start.
Okay. First of all, it's not a deficit, it's a debt. To get to 20 trillion, you have to include the Social Security and Medicare pieces, which they could write off if they wanted to. So maybe the real number is more like 12 or 13. Is it a national tragedy? Yes. Is it going to bankrupt us if we don't change the trend? Yes. If we listen to Simpson and Bowles, to Rivlin Domenici, to the Gang of Eight, there are a lot of good, sensible proposals from both sides of the aisle. We have a miracle this year. The United States Senate passed a budget resolution. They have not done that since 1990 or 2009. Sorry, 2009. Why did they do it? Because the Republicans were really, really clever. They passed a law through the House. Senators quickly realized, I better vote for this or I'm going to look like a real greedy character. And the bill said, both houses of Congress must follow the provisions of the Budget Improvement and Anti-Impoundment Act of 1974, which mandates both houses of Congress must pass a budget resolution by April 15. And in this new law, they said, if you don't do it, we will put your salary in escrow until you do it or the end of this Congress, which is December or January, early January of 2015. And lo and behold, it passed both houses. Maybe the difference is the Senate Budget Committee has a new, her official title is chairman. Go to their website. My wife tried to kill me. I said, you look it up. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from the state of Washington, got a budget through. It cuts the deficit by about $1.8 trillion over a decade. Paul Ryan got a budget. He's the House Budget Committee chairman. He got a budget through the House. It cuts about $4.5 trillion. President Obama illegally waited 2 months after the deadline to throw his budget into the pile, and every Republican and Democrat on Capitol Hill said, oh, thank you very much, we were running short of doorstops. Remember, in the United States, the president proposes, the Congress disposes. We have seen Congress beginning in August 2011, along with the president, agreeing on many laws, because they're now laws, to make that problem much less horrible. We still have a long ways to go, but they are moving in the right direction. So keep watching. It's not so bad as it was 2 years ago.
One of the charts that I often show when I show charts and it's not the debt outstanding that's the problem, it's the ability to finance the debt and where that goes. So right now, if you look at the debt GDP ratio and you include all the debt, it's about 100%, but we were over that during World War II and just after that. The problem is, with current trends, you get way above that 10, 20, 30 years from now because of entitlement spending. And the tax increases, particularly the spending cuts from the sequester, don't address those long-term issues at all. But a very fine economist that Jim and I knew, Herb Stein, better known as Ben Stein's dad, who, by the way, Ben Stein and I went to the same high school, but he's several years older than I am. He's, I guess, the second best economist from Montgomery Blair High School. Used to say that, and I'll paraphrase, unsustainable trends eventually end. And we don't know how they will necessarily end, but they will end. And we're already starting to see, as some of the things Jim just said, how this unsustainable trend will end, and it will. And the debt GDP ratio won't rise out of sight. It will come back down again to a level that is manageable, which is not zero. And you know, even we could have budget deficits every year as long as they're relatively small. The rest of the world's happy to finance small budget deficits for the U.S. forever. It's the big ones that will grow over time that they will be concerned about. They're not concerned yet, but they'll get there if we don't do anything. But we will do something. I think
We are doing it.
we are doing it now. We're starting to do it now.
And I'm sorry to take this, but the amount of money going into the economy has got to have some inflationary spiral. And I would offer that if you go to the gas station, the grocery store, the Home Depots, you are paying more, substantially more. We have inflation, but housing is pulling it down on the averages, which is being talked about.
Right,
Where
but
is the reality?
It's housing is not pulling it down, and I'm willing to talk to you about why that's the case. The federal budget does not cause inflation. The Fed causes inflation by too expansionary a monetary policy. People say, well, the Fed today is just simply the Treasury's lackey, buying, doing what they're doing in Japan. But in fact, the Fed is not doing that. The Fed, it may have the same impact, but they're providing liquidity to boost economic growth. And they will take that liquidity out again once growth picks up sufficiently. Believe me, they'll do that. The reason that economists look at what we call the core rate, take out food and energy, is that there are periods of time where food and energy climb rapidly, and then there are periods where they drop rapidly. If you just looked at and the CPI is not the best measure for you, so look at broader measures, the personal consumption expenditure core, take out those food and energy components. A better measure of what will happen to inflation tomorrow and next month and next year is not where the current overall PCE deflator is, but the core. Because this is what's happening to food and energy. Now, when it's going up, you're darn right, you're paying those higher prices. When it comes down, you're paying the lower prices. The trend may be upward, but that gets captured in other things. Overall inflation today is pretty modest. It really is. But unless the Fed takes significant action in coming years, it won't be modest. So we can talk more offline.
Go blue.
Go blue.
You mentioned earlier with Japan recently entering the quantitative easing, similar to what we're doing, but a much grander scale than in ratio GDP, that at some point Japan's economy is going to implode. If and when that happens, what are the ripple effects that you see worldwide and also here in the States?
Well, what are the ripple effects when Japan implodes? True answer, I don't know. Nobody does. It's going to hurt Asia much worse than it hurts North America or Europe. It will happen. It's unavoidable. Oh, well, it's not unavoidable. Japan, which has a debt to GDP ratio of about 300%, could announce tomorrow they're raising taxes dramatically. But unless they do that, and they're not going to, this all quantitative easing is going to do is ramp up the amount of imports to Japan. So they will run a current account deficit. Eventually, within a year or at most two, there will be no foreign exchange to pay that. So in order to float the next bond issue, they will have to sell it to foreigners, at which point, literally, all hell breaks loose. I can't tell you. No one could have told you, oh, what happens if Lehman Brothers goes broke on September 15, 2008? Now we know. All hell broke loose. The whole world went in the dumper. We don't know the interconnections. We just don't. But I will guarantee you, nothing good will come from that. Nothing.
Two comments and two questions, quickly. You mentioned the Social Security issue earlier, and one of the best comments I think I've heard most succinct about that issue was a 70-year-old Jewish widow who occupied an apartment in Skokie when I was a field rep for the Housing Authority of Cook County in the 70s, and I was doing a release on her apartment. And as I was about to leave, she looked up at me and without trying to be funny said, "You know, the trouble with living on a fixed income is it always needs fixing." And with respect to the previous speaker here, he mentioned the disparity between the decrease in housing prices and the increase in other prices. I pulled into a gas station yesterday and I filled my tank up from empty and the machine gave me a deed instead of a receipt. Like I bought the place.
John.
At any rate, two questions. Something hit the web this morning on a grad student at the University of Massachusetts and his girlfriend who had been doing a paper on some research in a paper done by gentlemen named Rogoff and Reinhardt.
One of them was a woman, by the way.
Pardon?
Rogoff and Reinhardt are not both gentlemen.
Reinhardt's a woman.
Okay.
Her husband would be very upset that you referred to his wife as...
And it wasn't the grad student at UMass Amherst and his girlfriend. It was the grad student at UMass Amherst and his dissertation committee professors. But that's okay. We know all about it, is the answer.
Well, the question is, and as I understand it, you can tell I'm not an economist, the issue was that the 2010 study done by the two economists said that a debt to GDP ratio over 90% is associated with lower growth. And evidently what they found is that there were errors in the methodology that this guy used.
So what Reinhardt and Rogoff and Reinhardt show in their paper was that if the debt to GDP ratio, and they looked over many countries over hundreds of years, when the debt GDP ratios rose over 90%, it wasn't that growth slowed, it was that growth was negative. What the UMass Amherst correction showed was that it's not negative, but it's slower. So the main point is correct, and that is you don't want to have high debt GDP ratios. It is associated with with paces of growth that are slower than lower debt burdens, but not necessarily negative growth. And that's the real difference. But, you know, slower growth is better than negative growth, but it's not as good as faster growth.
Okay, the other one, quickly, and I suspect you and I would agree that this is probably not going to get passed, but with the President's agreement to attach chained CPI for the increase in Social Security, if it did pass, what are your thoughts on what that would do to folks like us who are getting Social Security?
It probably will pass as bipartisan support.
Yeah. It may not pass this year, but ultimately that's one of the things that will.
Ultimately, it certainly will. It simply means that in 20 years, your taxes will be higher and your Social Security check will be smaller than otherwise, but it'll be a lot bigger than it is today. And if you have a private pension, that ain't going up at all. So it's a way of sharing the burden. Basically, we got into the pickle we're in because people over age 65 vote in huge numbers. So every politician from Franklin Roosevelt onward passed special laws for people over age 65, thinking we were going to have a permanent youthful group getting bigger and bigger. But after the baby boom, we had a baby bust. And so we have problems. And Social Security is easy to fix. Medicare, almost impossible.
Right.
And Joe, you need to create a special award unless you hauled Rebecca the first 2 years when I wasn't coming. This is our youngest participant to sit through the entire crystal ball. And she gets the last question. Oh, sorry.
Whatever.
You'll have to come up and ask.
But ask it loudly.
For one thing, I didn't sit through it, I listened. I like economics.
Yeah, Jim.
Good for
And
you.
my question is, if you were in charge of the whole America, what would you do with the economy?
Start over.
Well, I told you, I'd enact the flat tax, the fair tax, so you only pay taxes on what you spend. You don't pay anything on what you earn. There's no corporate tax, no Social Security tax, no Medicare tax, no estate tax, we repeal the 16th Amendment, which gave us the dreadful income tax, and we get rid of the Internal Revenue Service, and they have to go drive taxis or something.
See, I don't mind having some progressivity in the tax code, but I think modest is better. But it's clear that the incentives do matter, and if you had lower tax rates, in large part by expanding the base, you would have faster economic growth over the long run. And you'd actually generate more income for the government that way to spend than with slower growth. But you don't have to do it necessarily with a flat tax. Although a flat tax is one way to do it. But I think we're both agreed that lower tax rates are probably better for the economy, even if people at the upper end, as I would view it, would have a higher marginal rate than those at the lower end. You can still lower it all compared to today. That helps on the tax side, helps income. It still doesn't address entitlements. As Jim said, Medicare is a real mess, and we're not exactly sure how to fix that. Most economists would say that the best way to address Social Security is to change the age at which you're eligible to get full benefits. So if you're over a certain age, I'm 58, so 58 and above, there's no change. Well, but the point is, you need time to adjust to it. And so people approaching what would be the current age at which you would get maximum Social Security benefits aren't affected, and you change it. You're very young. You probably should face an age of 70 to maybe 75 at which you get full Social Security benefits. Because by the time you are my age, your life expectancy will be significantly greater than mine. So the question is, should you be able to retire at 67 and get the full amount of Social Security when you expect to live another 30 years after that? So basically, 1/3 of your life. When Social Security was first put into place, the life expectancy was not much different than the year at which you would first get it. You have lots of time to prepare for that. I don't have so much. You have none. Thank you very much for your question. It was a great question. Thank you all very much, and we'll stick around for more questions. Joe says there are handouts in the lobby.